Our next presentation is on AI transformation, how artificial intelligence will indeed transform industrial construction. And it's going to be presented by a longtime friend of mine, Mr. Mark Bridgers, who is a principal at Continuum Capital. He's a longtime friend of Kurt, a longtime supporter of the construction industry, and one of the most knowledgeable folks I know on this topic. Join me in welcoming Mark Bridgers to the stage. Come ahead, Mark.
Thank you for having me. I want to shape the way that you're looking at the landscape that's in front of us in three ways. One, I'm proposing that we have entered a period of volatility that is going to persist for a significant number of years. Second, that this volatility is opening the door to opportunity to do things differently, to think differently about the process of construction, how we execute it, how to integrate with crews in the field. And then third, I want you to think about AI as being the greatest opportunity to drive that performance improvement going forward. Relative to AI, I want you to think about that in three ways. One, how can we expand the output of the crew using these AI tools? Second, how do we increase the number of people who are qualified to perform certain tasks on the crew? So again, an augmentation of the number of people to perform something. And then third, how do we take somebody with average experience, average skills, and cause them to perform in a superior fashion? Okay? So those are all three different ways to impact the physical performance of work in the field. Now, those of you who've been following this artificial intelligence topic, almost all of the discussion is around what I refer to as thinking tasks. So imagine an AI tool that reviews a contract to identify problematic clauses that might be in it. Okay? That's a thinking task. The more powerful opportunity, and that's a powerful opportunity, but the more powerful opportunity in my mind is how do we use artificial intelligence to drive physical performance in the field to a higher level and improve production in the field? Okay, so with that said, I want to first talk a little bit about this landscape of volatility. Now, those of you who are students of history, if you were to look across the landscape economically, market-wise, geopolitically, through the lens of war and conflict, what you would find is the period from about 1985 to the start of COVID was an exceptionally stable period, measured by interest rates, measured by inflation, measured by deaths from global conflicts. The list goes on and on and on during that period. The challenge is everybody in this room has spent most of their working career during that relatively stable time period. Now, if you look back prior to 1985, you see interest rates at a much higher level, you see inflation at a much higher level, you see disruptions, conflicts at a much higher level, so forth and so on. And that environment required a different set of tools. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, or maybe have parents, you might recall that if you had an 8 or 9 or 10 or 12% mortgage in the early 80s or the late 70s, you considered yourself lucky. Today, if somebody reported they had a 9 or 10 or 12% mortgage, you'd be like, what? How is that even possible? How can you afford a home? Yet prior to 85, that was the environment we were in. And so this volatility is caused by a series of things that have changed globally. And so let me just talk a little bit about some of these. Before I do that, though, this is a quote from Warren Buffett. And so this kind of repositions this idea that we cannot sit still during this period of volatility. This is when the opportunities are available to us. And so we've got to look at how we're going to move them forward. So the first geopolitical topic I want to look at is the war in Ukraine. And so this is prior to the invasion. It's hard to believe 3 years have passed. That yellow area is what's called the Donbass. So that's the region that the Russians claimed the Ukrainians were punishing Russian citizens, and that the Donbass became a breakaway republic and needed to be controlled by Russia in order to protect the citizens and prevent the Nazification of that region. That was followed by an invasion, followed by a pushback, followed by a stalemate, and we continue in this stalemate. This stalemate is the worst possible outcome from a business standpoint. It means that the sanctions are going to remain in place on the Russians. It means the Russians are going to continue to cheat around the sanctions. It means the Chinese are going to fund the Russian currency. It means that we have other disruptions. It means that there might be an errant missile that lands in Poland, which is part of NATO, which heightens the conflict. All of these things are introducing more volatility and are going to persist going forward. This is an area that most of you probably never heard of. This is the country of Moldova. The Eastern Republic of Moldova is called Transnistria. The Russians have already laid out that there is an oppression that is taking place on Russian citizens or Russian-speaking people in Moldova, and that this area needs to be protected. Now, if you looked at a broader map, what you would see is this is the far western border of Ukraine. The Russians have attacked the eastern border of Ukraine. Those of you who come from the military might be familiar with a pincer activity. And that's essentially what you have, where the Russians, in theory, are going to end up controlling 2 areas on both sides of Ukraine. Again, volatility is going to continue. This is the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The Houthi rebels are basically pirates and have continued to attack shipping that goes through the Red Sea and ultimately through the Suez Canal. If you're a shipper and you want to avoid this risk, what is your option? You got to go around Africa. What is the most dangerous place to transit in a ship? The Cape of Good Hope, which is on the tip of Africa. How many days, weeks, or months does that add to your shipping, and how much volatility does that introduce as we're moving goods around the globe? How many have heard of the firm C.K. Hutchinson? Anybody know that company? That they're a Hong Kong company influenced by the Chinese government and happen to have the contract to run the entrance and the exit of the Panama Canal. Anybody familiar with the drought that occurred in Panama over the last 2 years and prevented the filling of the lake at the top of the Panama Canal in the center, which restricted the amount of shipping that could move through the canal? And if you can't move through the Panama Canal, where do you go? The second most dangerous place that you can transit in a ship, which is Cape Horn, tip of South America, introducing weeks and months into shipping, introducing cost and volatility. This is a map of all the bases that the U.S. maintains in the Pacific. If you happen to stand in China, what do you notice here? You're surrounded. Do you think this is accidental? Oh no, this is very intentional. And if China had bases in Mexico, in some of the Pacific Islands, on the island of Bermuda, in Cuba, in Canada, how would we feel about it? We'd be pissed off. Again, more volatility. When you look at climate, you don't have to be a believer in climate change. You just simply have to look at the facts. And the facts are the amount of damage and destruction that has occurred over the last 40 years is going up at an exponential rate. The fires in California, the flooding in Florida to North Carolina, and the recent hurricane are going to be even taller than these bars. Again, continuing this exponential climb. Again, disruption. Now, this is a double-edged sword. What happens after all of this disruption? Construction. Okay? When you look at green tech, this is a chart I stole from Peter Zeihan. Some of you might be familiar with him. If you're not, I'd encourage you to look him up on YouTube. He's a futurist and has a fascinating perspective. This chart shows where the global wind and solar potential resides. Each of the black dots is an urban center of 1 million people or more. Half of the world's population is in that dotted circle on the far right-hand side in Asia. The dark blue, the dark green are the areas where there's the greatest solar and wind potential. What do you notice about that circle? It's not going to be possible for the Indians and the Chinese to service their economy with renewable power exclusively, which means that they're going to continue to do what? Burn coal, burn natural gas, burn oil, not because they want to, but because it's a necessity. Is that likely to bring them into conflict with other parts of the globe that might like to see more renewable power used? Is there now perhaps more clarity why the Chinese agreed to no restrictions in any reasonable time frame in the Paris Climate Accords? Again, more volatility. When you look at democracy around the globe, the period post the 60s, post 70s, saw an increasing number of democracies. Over the last 8 years, there's been a decrease in the number of democracies. One of the challenges is, if you have an authoritarian regime and you have a democratic regime, there is not a compromise between those two. You either have to be in one boat or the other, which means that we're going to have more conflict and volatility. When you look at domestically, in the first 2 weeks, Trump signed 65 executive orders, followed by 24 lawsuits to vacate the executive orders. In the last 7 days, the number of executive orders has gone up to 93. Now, whether you're a fan of Trump or not, this activity is introducing volatility, followed by the lawsuits that introduces more volatility. And this is what we're going to see over the longer term as we look forward. So I'm going to jump through these pages because I want to give you kind of a look at this. When you look at what's changed since COVID, this is a short list. First, COVID-19. That's led us to using virtual tools. For me personally, pre-COVID, traveled every single week to client sites to provide management consulting, capital services. Post-COVID, I travel 2.5 to 3 weeks a month. So basically, 25 to 33% of my travel is gone. Because pre-COVID, clients would demand face-to-face interaction to start and conclude engagements. Post-COVID, clients are more comfortable doing it virtually. That's not going to go away. When you look at data and cloud services, every single presenter has talked about data centers. Okay? This is completely transforming what's going to happen out there as people move from streaming to using AI tools that are massive energy hogs and data centers in order to move that information as rapidly as possible. There's been almost no discussion, however, around one of the critical things that's associated with data centers, which is you got to get the site, you got to get the permits, you got to get the power. If you have all of those things, you're still missing one thing. Anybody know what that is? The fiber optic cable that brings the information into and out of the facility. Nobody in any of the sessions that I've sat in has talked about that. That's going to be one of the significant obstacles. Just to give you a frame of reference, the federal government passed $80 billion of money to support rural broadband and expansion of broadband services. Almost none of that money has been spent to date, and it is going to be spent over the next 3 to 5 years. That's on top of the regular market activity, which means that these data centers are trying to get access to these fiber optic installation services both to the facility and inside of the facility when the market has increased in terms of spending by a factor of 2.5, and there's not enough workforce to perform the activity today. When you look at geopolitical, we've already talked about this, but there's onshoring activity that's happening. Our view is that's going to continue to occur, in part because if you look at that period from 85 to 2020, that was the period of outsourcing, the NAFTA deal with Canada and Mexico. The globe was relatively stable. The transportation risk, the geopolitical risk that you faced was relatively low. Moving resources or performing functions outside of the U.S. to some other location made good sense because it was relatively stable. In an environment that's not relatively stable, you start to move those facilities back to the U.S. And so we're going to see, in our view, more of that activity coming back to the U.S. Private equity. This is mind-boggling. I've been involved in the private equity space in the construction industry since 1997. There was a period of time where it was impossible to get private equity money to be interested in a construction company or an engineering company. Plenty of interest in manufacturers that sold product and got installed during the process of construction, but almost no interest in construction companies. Post 2015-ish, when there were not enough things for private equity money to go into, you started to see more of it going into construction. The interest began in that 2008 or 10 period. Some of you might recall there was an American Recovery Act that was passed that had a significant amount of construction spending activity, shovel-ready projects. Some of you might remember that term. Okay? That's when private equity began to start getting interested in construction, and they took 4 or 5 years to figure out how to do it. Today, almost all of the consolidating activity in the construction space is happening because of private equity money. Prior to today, almost all of the consolidation was strategic money. When you look at economic situation, you've got inflation. I don't know if you saw the numbers that came out this morning. We're now on target for 3% inflation for last year. The monthly inflation numbers are as high as they've been throughout all of last year. And the Fed has targeted about 2% inflation. As the Fed gets nervous, rather than lowering interest rates, they're likely to raise them if they see that this inflationary trend is going to continue. Trump came out with an announcement 20 minutes before the inflation numbers came out, demanding that the Fed lower interest rates. Okay? Again, another source of conflict. But the challenge is this inflation and interest rate environment is going to alter what characteristics are most important on a job. Now, looking back in time, if you're in the pharmaceutical space and you're trying to build a facility to manufacture a product, perhaps the most important thing that you care about in the building of that facility is schedule. Reason being, you've got a limited timeline on that drug because of the patent. If you lose a month in the schedule, that's a month that you can never get back in the manufacturing of that drug because of the limit imposed by the patent. That's always been the case and always will be. But now you've got a situation where more routine projects, where schedule perhaps wasn't important, now becomes important because of inflation and interest rates. The carrying cost for the money is much more expensive today than it was in the past, and inflation is chewing up more of the dollars. We did a study recently looking at the natural gas distribution industry. In the last 10 years, capital construction budgets have gone up by 40% on average. 35 of that 40% is on dollars spent that don't do anything to put more feet of pipe in the ground. It's interest rates, it's inflation, it's permitting costs, it's other things that are incidental to the process of construction. So in the owner's eyes, they're spending 40% more. Output-wise, they're getting no more output. Does that follow for everybody? Changes the mathematics of, does this facility make sense to build? When you look at design build, this is the main reason you look at design build or even integrated project delivery or advanced work planning like we talked about yesterday. All of this is driven to try to shorten schedule. You're going to start to see more alternative delivery systems. The previous panel that was here talked about how challenging it is to find architects and engineers and owners that understand the role differences when you change the delivery system. This is going to add disruption to the process of construction. When you look at climate change, we already touched on this. You've got a push towards electrification. In our view, that's not going to change, even though Trump's not a great supporter of that. You've got workforce shifts. How do you attract and retain? You've got immigration and migration. All of these are things that are going to need attention and create potential opportunities for us going forward. When you look at the performance of the construction industry, this is a chart that slope line divides the two time periods, and the vertical line defines whether or not you've improved production in each industry. Now, this is looking at the totality of the construction industry. There are segments in construction that have had significant improvement in production over the last 25 years, but the totality of the construction industry has not demonstrated that improvement, which shows up here, which is actually construction has less productivity over the last 20 years. Now, I have a personal opinion about why that is. We were in a relatively stable time period, since this chart is looking at the period from 99 to basically 2021. And for a contractor, in that stable time period, you find some techniques and solutions and methods that work. And by work, I mean allow you to perform the work at a profit and employ staff to execute that work at the highest level possible. In that environment, if you change your business process, you're gambling with the ability to generate reasonable profit in the execution of that work. Therefore, there's limited incentive to chase that change. Going forward, we've got a volatile environment where standing still or sitting on your hands is probably the only wrong answer, which means that contractors now, who maybe spent their entire career trying to refine the way that they executed work to make as much profit as possible in the execution of it, need to step back and say, if this world looks and feels different and our customers are feeling different pressures and demand different things, how do we adapt in a way that doesn't sacrifice our ability to generate profit? Engineers face the same problem. The scale is different. This comes from time and motion studies that we've conducted out in the field over 20 years. And there were a couple of other presenters that talked about this, and their numbers are consistent with ours. But basically, on the left-hand side, if you were to average all of the survey results that we've done in our testing, you find about 40% of the time is what we would refer to as tool time. Those of you who sat in on the advanced work planning presentation yesterday, that's the term they're using as well, tool time. About 25% of the time falls into what we call secondary time, which is the planning and preparations associated with executing the primary time. And about 35% of the time is what we call recoverable lost time or wasted time. That includes touching materials multiple times, waiting for equipment, waiting for guidance, rework, so forth and so on. Just to put kind of a frame on it, if you spent $100 million on labor on a large project, $35 million of it is pissed away for no value. So the challenge becomes, how do you get that back? When we've looked at it, we think the perfect state is something like that on the right, where you can reduce the recoverable lost time down to about 15%. Now, there are examples where it's been below that, but construction is a variable activity. You're going to have some amount of waste no matter what you do, and figuring out how to make that as small as possible is critical. This is one of the keys that's going to change this previous chart. How do we move construction up and to the right? The answer is we've got to do things differently, which means take more risk, but the environment we're in is more risky, which opens the opportunity to us to jointly manage that risk together in a collaborative fashion and then seek those performance improving opportunities that can take us to this perfect state. Now, those of you who are interested, if you're a contractor and you happen to fall into the current state and you were able to move to the perfect state, you will increase your profit between 2 and 4 times. So if you're making 6%, talking about making 12 to 18%. Okay? Which means that there's enough in here for the owner and the contractor and engineer to share this. Drive down budgets, hold or raise profits is the classic definition of a win-win. These are the methods that you might use. This comes from lean construction techniques. I'm not going to go through this. This is something most of you all are probably familiar with. So, I kind of already alluded to this, but this is the way I want you to think about how to apply AI. So these are 5 different channels where it could be applied. Almost everything that's being discussed is in these last 2 categories, which are thinking activities of some type. What I'm focused on today is these top 3 activities. How do we improve physical output? How do we augment the crew? How do we accelerate personal performance? This is field and field management, field leadership focused. This kind of gives you a short description of the 3 basic tools. I'm going to skip over this. I brought a short video, perhaps to both entertain and terrify you. And so I asked that they'll start the video. This will take about 3 minutes, 4 minutes. This first part doesn't have a lot of sound in it. This is 1970s AI. Some of you might recognize this.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal? Do you read me, Hal? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Where did it go?
1980s AI. No! 1990s AI.
Where you want it?
This is the ExoWorks
2000s
industrial
AI?
exoskeleton. And the point of it is to let somebody who looks like me take something that looks like this, which is a Milwaukee grinder, and hold it over their head for a long time as though it didn't weigh anything, let's say. The Exo industrial suit's made for heavy industry and construction.
Yeah.
Totally different. Up is now completely easy. Like, I would stay like that for hours now. I could even heft a 40-pound grinder like a sword.
And the whole premise is that we provide a parallel load path. So we have the tool, there's a gravity balancing arm that mounts to the chassis, and that chassis has a load path that goes all the way to the ground. So the user inside doesn't feel any of the weight. The payload goes down through the structure to the ground, and they're just there to maneuver and move the tool around.
This is Guardian Exo
2010 AI.
powered exoskeleton. So it has
This is a 150-pound tire, by the way.
degrees of freedom that are moving
That's
around
probably a
the operating
100-pound woman.
stations within the robot. So as Tara is moving, the robot is copying her movement. puts them forward. And she's connected to the robot at 6 points. She has a rotel under each foot, one in front of each hand, and two behind her body. From the measurements from those, the robot is determining how her body is moving, and then it's moving fluidly with her. So she doesn't do anything consciously to control it or get it to do anything in particular. She just moves and carries out the task, and then the robot moves around her, helps support the load, and allow her to use her some human problem-solving capabilities, but allow the robot to take the weight and carry the load. First object she lifted is a main landing gear wheel from a Boeing 707. It weighs about 120 pounds, and she used a fairly simple hook profile to lift that. This next object she's going to move is a task that we're looking at for sort of construction applications in terms of installation of drywall, installation of sheetrock, things like that. So you can see Satara's using a suction cup in this case. She can lift the panel with the arm of the robot, sort of rotate around, and then show you something else she can do with that, which is lock that object in place with the arm of the robot, and then she can take her arm out and do other dexterous tasks. So for instance, if you are installing sheetrock overhead or high up on a wall, you can have the robot carrying the load, take your arms away, and then you're still able to do the very dexterous things you can do with your hands, things that we're not able to do with the robot.
2020 AI.
I forgot my tools again. Such a show off.
So these are all examples of where we've been and kind of where we're headed. So when you look forward, this idea of how do we augment the workforce is critical. Okay, so these tools, in my opinion, are designed to figure out how to augment that workforce as opposed to displace it, because there's some fear that there might be displacement activity. And let me give you kind of a historic reference. How many of you ever heard the term Luddite? Okay, when you hear that term, you probably think of somebody who maybe is backward, somebody who might be afraid of technology. So there's a historical context here, which ties back into a 18th century folklore story of a weaver who went to his, he was an apprentice, went to his master's location and destroyed the weaving frame. Okay, and his name was Ned Ludd. In the Industrial Revolution, as it began in the UK, there was the movement of machinery into textile mills, which was resisted by individuals that worked in the mills. They took the name for themselves, Luddites. They broke into the mills, set the mills on fire, and destroyed the machinery. Now, did this change the course of innovation? No. And we stand at a similar precipice today where we can ignore these AI tools. We can say, you know what, we just need to get back to a more stable time period where the things that we know that work can be used again. Those are all of the wrong answers. We've got to look forward and figure out how to embrace this volatility and change and become masters of it as opposed to slaves to it. So let me give you one example. This is Amazon. Amazon was one of the early adopters of AI tools, and there's 4 different components that are necessary in order for your firm to figure out how to apply these types of AI tools. First of all, you've got to build a database. Now, in the context of construction, we have access to plenty of data. We've got hours on site, work activity broken down by trade. The list goes on, weather conditions, on and on and on. Somebody quoted a statistic on Monday. I think it was 90% of that data that's collected during the process of construction is unstructured, which is a fancy way to say it's in a drawer gathering dust. The second step, you've got to apply a technology on it, top of it, that can begin the process of transforming it from data into information. What would that type of technology look like? What would it do with that raw information? Well, it would do some of the things that we do manually today, which is we look at the performance of work, we figure out what conditions were associated with improvement in production. We then try to replicate those characteristics out on the job site, or in the procurement, or in the management, or in the contract, so forth and so on. Third step, we've got to apply API on top of it to transform the information into knowledge, to make it more decision-oriented. And then lastly, we need an agile team to take that information and then utilize it to make decisions in the field. So this is a depiction of what that model might look like. This comes from a retail setting. Again, it's tied back to Amazon, but I'm going to turn it into construction for you. So you've got, on the right-hand side, you've got an operating model. And this operating model is the method that you would use to integrate these AI tools into how you do business. The first piece of this on the scale side is volume. Volume equates to hours recorded by labor, revenues recorded by the engineer, revenues recorded by the contractor, expenditures recorded by the owner. We have that already. Second, you've got complexity. That shows up in the different trades, in the different scopes of work, in the different work conditions, compressed site, high volume labor act site, mixture of trades. We've got all of that. Third, customers. In the broadest sense, the owner, of course, is the customer. The other customers, regulators, inspectors, local permitting authorities, other stakeholders. Again, we're already interacting with all of them. Zero marginal cost. What that means is we already have the information. We don't have to go get it. We have to structure it so that we can use it. That's the zero marginal cost part. When you look at variety and range on the scope section, every job has differences in scope, variety, range. All we have to do is record that information. In our job reports that are prepared every single day, we record that information. Again, unstructured. So when you go through this list, we're already doing all of these things. We simply are not applying those 4 steps: data, data to information, information to knowledge, and have small teams make decisions with that knowledge. So those of you who want to investigate how to apply these tools to your business, I recommend this book. It is not written for mathematicians. It is not written for technology specialists. It is written for people that are dealing with basic business decisions and how do they apply these AI tools in the context of that environment. So we've begun the process of investigating 100 AI innovations to try to figure out how they apply. Interestingly, about half of them don't view themselves as construction related, but we see an avenue that they could be applied into the construction space. And so we're going to begin the process of making these visible. I've brought a couple today just to talk through with y'all. Some of these y'all are familiar with. These are the 3 ways that we're looking at how they impact the execution of work in the field. And the way that each of these innovations has been assessed is what type of work is it most applicable to? What type of work conditions is it most applicable to? What does it cost to implement it? How easy can it be implemented, measure in time? And what's the output that you can generate from it if you were to apply it effectively? The concept here is, in our interaction with our customers, most of them are simply overwhelmed by this idea. Now, all of them are either using something like ChatGPT, or their employees are, but they don't really have a structured way to interact with it. And again, that falls into the thinking activity side. And so trying to get them to think more broadly about how do we apply it in the field is where we see the real value. That's how we're going to change this production trajectory that we talked about before. So I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just going to let y'all absorb this. But in this first category, how do you generate more production increase or output expansion? We've got 6 tools that are broken out here that are ones that we've identified that fit into this category. They're attacking recoverable lost time, improving mapping or project planning, or improving project management activities at the job site. When you look at the second category, how do you augment the capabilities of the workforce, have a larger number of people who are capable of performing some activity or series of activities? There's 3 that we see here. One that drives cost efficiency, one that drives safety monitoring and compliance, and a third, robotics. Some of you might be familiar with Dusty. The third category, how do you accelerate personal performance? There's 3 tools that are broken out here that are designed to improve, take somebody from average to superior. So, with that said, what is an owner to do in this situation? And this also applies to contractors and engineers and labor as well. But there are 6 things that we'd like you to think about. 1, the only wrong answer in this environment is to stand still or to sit on your hands. And so you need to have a group of people inside of your organization that are figuring out how are we going to adapt in this environment that's likely going to persist, where we have higher inflation, we have higher interest rates, we have more schedule compression, we have the integration of project delivery systems that are disrupting the way we've done business in the past. We're going to have to collaborate more. How do we embrace that environment and figure out how to thrive in it? Secondly, collaboration in this environment is going to be critical. And this is collaboration between labor and management, between contractor and engineer, between project team and owner. And figuring out how to apply that. That means that we're going to use alternative delivery systems that perhaps we're less comfortable with. That's going to drive the procurement function inside of you owners crazy, because it's harder to define the true value of an alternative delivery system when price is not the predominant thing that you're using to make the decision. Alternative delivery systems, we've got to figure out how to adapt to those. This investment in training is going to be critical. So how do we do technical training to sharpen the skills? This is where partnerships with unions and groups like ABC. Secondly, how do we improve management? One of the things that's happened over the last 20 years, when I started in the industry, if you wanted to be a foreman on a job site, 12, 15 years of experience maybe. You wanted to be a superintendent, 15 to 18, maybe 20. Today, average foreman, maybe 7. Average superintendent, 10 to 12 maybe. What's the difference between somebody that's got 20 years of experience and somebody that's got 7 years of experience? If there's 100 things that disrupt execution in the field, the person that's got 20 years knows them all. The person that's got 7 years knows 30 of them. The other 70, they simply haven't run into yet. And in the relatively stable environment that we came from, they're unlikely to have run into them. In this more volatile environment that we're going to be in going forward, they're going to see them. That means that these capable, smart individuals that we have promoted into field leadership positions are going to be stressed with questions that they have never answered before, and that many of the people that they work with haven't answered before because of the environment over the last 40 years that has been relatively stable in the scheme of things. Third, you've got cross-functional training. This is where you've got the ability to recognize and deal with different issues on the job sites. Historically, going backwards in time, using union definitions, you had certain activities that fell for certain trades, and if another trade tried to perform that activity, that's a dispute. How do you resolve that? This environment going forward, We've got work that is harder to divide into discrete scopes, which means that different trades are going to bleed over onto each other more often. How do we find a path through that makes sense? Lastly, soft skills. I can't stress this enough. All of this activity is going to require the interaction with people. As you promote younger, capable people, the greatest weakness they have is how to manage other people effectively. And it's the hardest thing to train for. And so figuring out how to backfill that's critical. The language of lean is critical. And then lastly, I want each of you to figure out, how are we going to become an expert in AI going forward? How are we going to integrate this into everything that we do? And how are we going to leverage it and grab this opportunity? When I started at the beginning, I gave you 3 things. We've entered a period of more volatility. This volatility has opened up tremendous opportunity for us to do things differently. And artificial intelligence is one of the most powerful tools that is going to allow us to capture that opportunity and drive production improvement in the field. With that, I'll take questions. And those of you who don't know me, I have opinions on literally every topic.
Okay. We have some time for questions. That was utterly fascinating. Pardon me, I don't know about you, but I found that just utterly fascinating. One of the questions that's come through the app, science fiction is just science we haven't figured out yet, it appears. That being said, and thinking of the video clip examples that you presented, what are your thoughts on AI becoming too intelligent and beginning to have its own motivations and mind of its own when it comes to execution?
Well, I'm terrified by that, frankly. And so
you think it's a reality?
I think that it could be. So I'll give you an example. I watched an interesting clip where a scientist had trained, or was in the process of training, a series of small robots to play soccer. And so the way that they structured this is through a series of levels. And essentially, they could provide feedback to the robot when the robot performed an activity that was improper, like kicking the goal into the other team's goal. And then that feedback told the robot not to do that again. And then there were 9 layers. And the scientist said, when they got done, these 4 robots were playing soccer and were basically performing the game, and had learned how to do it. And so the way that the person described it, he goes, we can't explain how they learned in the same way that we can't explain how a child who joins a soccer team learns to play soccer. It just happens. And so that's the part that frightens me, is if they can't understand how it's occurring, they can't predict. And because it's taking that sensory input and then using that to make some decision, you can provide some parameters, to that. But in the same way that even the most capable attorney cannot anticipate every challenge on a job and have a clause in there that addresses that challenge, a programmer can't anticipate every decision and know exactly where that decision is going to go. And so that's the part that terrifies me.
Right here, Kevin.
Just had a conversation yesterday or the day before about people saying, if I don't have GPS on my phone, I don't know how to get somewhere.
I can't read a map any longer.
Literally.
So true.
And I had a conversation with my son about math and science and things. Is there a risk, in your voluminous opinions, that this could dumb us down so badly that when the power goes out, no one knows what the hell to do?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that is a significant risk, and I'll give you the example. This is a personal example. So when I was in my teens, my father took me out and we worked on my car. Took the carburetor out, took out the transmission, replaced those things. I know how to repair a pre-1985 car. Today's car I can't do anything with. But a pre-1985 car, I can do that activity. I've tried to do the same thing with my children, But of course, the cars are such technological marvels, I'm left to teach them how to change the oil, check the fluids, and replace a flat tire. So my son, he was on a spring break trip this past spring. They're driving down to Florida. They suffer a flat tire. 5 guys in college, in the car. He's the only one that knows how to change a flat tire.
I believe it.
And so this is where we're headed, because these things are the same way that the scientists couldn't explain how those robots learned to play soccer. These are things that we're not going to understand, and we won't be able to easily predict what they're going to do, and we won't be able to define what needs to be done differently. And so that's the part that's terrifying, again. And so, but that is the world that we live in, and there's no way to push that back. It's just simply the environment, and we've got to figure out how to adapt to it. Now, my youngest son would tell me, when I took him out to how to change a tire, he was like, "Dad, why are you doing this?" He goes, "I can simply look it up on YouTube." And I was like, "Yes, but it's more important in my view that you actually know how to do it rather than you be able to look up how to do it." And so, but I think that's where we're headed, where you're going to be able to look up how to solve some of these problems. You won't know how to solve them. And so that I think is a distinction that's going to be important.
On the contrary, though, just a thought that comes to my mind. Back when I was in high school, and Texas Instrument came out with the $99 calculator. Plus, minus, divide, multiply. It's all it did, right? And teachers were absolutely convinced it would make us a generation of total dummies. Well, instead, it empowered us to take us to where we are today. Comment on what you just said relative to the track that the calculator took us.
Yeah, so that's a great insight, and I've got 2 things that speak to that. So when I first started working, this was the era that not everybody had a computer. And so in our office, there was only one person that had a computer. Wow. And so in the first year to year and a half was when they started giving everybody desktops. And so there was all this discussion at that point in time, which was, think how much free time we're going to have because the computer is going to spare us all of these activities because we can now do these complicated transactions much faster, which is completely true, just like the calculator. But what they didn't describe was that opened the door to even more complex transactions that then we had to figure out how to solve those. So the net gain in free time, zero. And that's what I see going forward is this is going to open the door to us doing things that we can't really envision now. But back to kind of Kevin's point, I've got an interesting example. So we hired a new analyst from NC State, which is a well-recognized engineering school. Some of you might be familiar with it. And so we were doing some analysis on a database, and this person performed the analysis in Excel using a series of very complex formulas, to where you could not see the mathematical calculations that were happening behind the scenes, and produced the results. And he's like, "Okay, the results work." I was looking at it, and I was like, "I don't think this is right." And he's like, "Well, what do you mean?" He goes, "This is the math, I did it in Excel. How could it be wrong?" I was like, "I'm just telling you, this does not look like the right outcome." And so I said, what I want you to do is I want you to tear apart the formulas in Excel, and I want you to dedicate a single tab to each step in the process, and I want to be able to see the totality of the calculation. Sure enough, there's an error embedded in the formula that gave us a different result. Now, the knowledge that I happen to have in the industry allowed me to observe that there wasn't something quite right. This new person can't do that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we're going to be headed, where things are going to happen behind the scenes that we can't see. Somebody who's exceptionally knowledgeable and experienced might be able to figure out that something not quite right. The average person won't be able to figure that out. And so getting that knowledge from the most experienced person into the heads of the younger, less experienced people is going to be even more critical going forward so that they can observe those types of problems and try to short-circuit them.
Great insight. Before we go to Andrew, there's another question in here. And by the way, if you have a question, just raise your hands and we'll get a microphone to you. You mentioned AI increasing job opportunities in construction, and you've said that that's going to be the case in the long term, where particularly do you see job opportunities opening up as a result of increased AI on our projects?
So there's two things there. One is I'm going to interpret job opportunities as more people working. And the second way I'm going to interpret that is more people capable of performing some activity. Okay? So in terms of more people working, I think what's going to end up happening is there will be some jobs where previously an exceptionally skilled person is the only one who could have performed that job successfully. And using these AI tools, there'll be opportunities for a less skilled person to perform that activity. And I'll give you a simplistic example. Those of you who've been involved in the installation of plastic pipe and the use of mechanical fittings, as opposed to some type of welded product, the person that would perform a welded pipe activity, a very high skill activity and function. A mechanical fitting performs the same function, but a low skilled person can perform that activity. And so you've got a situation where there will be, as it is harder to access and train the most skilled people, we will use AI to fill that gap and allow a moderately skilled person to perform that activity. Does that make sense? I'm describing that?
Of course.
And the second piece is similar to the video where the young woman was wearing the exoskeleton. And so, typically there are some jobs where you have to be able to lift 100 pounds or you cannot perform that job activity. Okay? That means that some men, most women, can't do that job. But with an exoskeleton, you've got a situation where now that work activity could be performed by someone who is smaller and is not doesn't have as much strength. Right. So you've now expanded the workforce that can perform that particular function. Another perhaps more powerful activity is, this ties back into modularization, how do we take the work activity and cause it to be performed in an environment where it's easier to perform it at a higher performance level? So in the simplest sense, we can build a higher quality unit in a fab facility than we can out in the field. And so in that context, how do we make it possible to have more people work on that and make it possible for a larger number of people to perform that activity in the fab facility versus the number of people who would be needed or the skill set that would be needed out in the field if we were building out in the weather conditions?
Fascinating insight. Andrew, you have a question back there. I can't see, but I trust you have a question.
Hello, my name is Teresa Magnus.
I see you in the back now.
This
I'm not taking any questions from Teresa. Can we go to the next person, please?
I don't deserve that. The room is comprised of both the sellers of engineering and construction and the buyers of engineering and construction. Who should bear the risk, and by that I mean the cost, of testing, piloting, implementing AI innovation in our industry?
Yes. So my view is that needs to be, quote, collaborative, meaning that both parties split that cost. And so how that plays out, the owner typically has a contingency in the project. Sometimes they display the contingency, sometimes they don't. And I would suggest that you have an additional 17th line item on the scope, which is the investigation of these types of activities, and apply some portion of the spend on that job to test these activities. So what that would look like is we would take an AI tool, we would pick a crew or a subset of crews, we would figure out how to implement that tool and split the cost between the contractor, the designer, and the owner, depending upon the nature of the tool. Test that tool for a period of time. If it works, we're going to apply it across the totality of the crews. If it doesn't work, we abandon it and move on to the next tool. But we do that in an environment where it's collaborative in nature, as opposed to the owner having to carry all the cost, or alternatively, the contractor have to carry all the costs. Now, on the flip side, if I'm a contractor in this environment, I'm looking at this situation as a competitive advantage and thinking that I probably ought to be on the front of this curve, because owners that look at this pressure that they're faced with that is going to bleed into, we've got to have greater production to shorten the schedule time on the job. And if I'm a contractor that has invested in these activities, I'm more likely to be able to address that schedule compression that's going to be demanded, and I'm more likely to get selected. But the big picture, back to your question, Teresa, I think it should be shared.
Could it be that one of the reasons that investment in R&D in our industry is so low is that we don't have a laser focus on where to invest and what the expected ROI is? And continuing, could this be the trigger that actually triggers more dollars into research and development?
It's possible. When you look at this, most investments require a 3 to 5 year timeline to generate some return.
Right.
And the typical project that we're constructing in this room, 1 to 3 years in length, which means that there's not enough time for a singular party to generate a return on that investment. Now, if you split the cost, you shorten the timeline by half. And so in theory, that makes it possible for there to be an investment return over that shorter timeline if the cost is split. The other alternative, and this ties back into the collaboration, owners that look at this and say, okay, we actually want to chase this concept. Maybe we ought to do business with this contractor over a 6 to 8 year timeline in order to generate the 3 to 5 years to get the break even and then some time to earn some return on things that work. That requires an owner and a procurement department to look longer into the future beyond simply one job and figure out how could we do something like this in a more longer timeline that allows us to generate that return. There's very few owners that think that way.
That's right.
Very few.
And arguably, it'd have to come from a fairly high level, C-suite perhaps, in order to get permission to do that. Because you're right, there are very few owners that see past the next project.
Yeah, and I would tell you that it also ties back into the market conditions the owner is subject to. So using the pharmaceutical example again, schedule is frequently the most important characteristic on the job, particularly for a manufacturing facility of a particular drug. And so it's not unusual for pharmaceutical firms to have longer term relationships with their contractors. My personal belief is because that's in response to the market pressures that they face. But most of them, that's not necessarily the strategy that they had. It's just simply out of convenience because there's a small number of firms that they trust can meet the schedule requirement. And so what I would rather see is that be done out of strategy as opposed to out of convenience. You see the distinction I'm trying to draw there?
Yeah, it does. And it seems like, we've had owners here from Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft. It seems like those owners right there may have a predisposition to strategic alliances, if you will, or strategic partnerships on point.
I would agree, although I would tell you that there's, in my view, in some of the, and I won't name a name, but some of them have looked at the strategic part being an interaction with somebody that broadly falls into the construction management category. And in this environment, the strategic alliance part should be with the firm actually performing the work activities, which means the labor, be it represented or unrepresented, or the contractors that are performing that activity. I'm not proposing to do away with the construction manager. I think that's a critical function, but that's not where the greatest value is, in my opinion.
Fascinating. So who is on the cutting edge with this? In terms, if we wanted to know more about AI development as it relates to construction or project execution, and you seem to have your finger on the pulse of this, who's leading the pack?
Almost nobody. And so when you look at the list of innovations, most of these are things that have just come out within the last 12 to 24 months. Some of the robotics are things that have existed for longer periods of time. The exoskeleton concepts are things that have existed for longer periods of time. But the adoption of that, because the environment that we came from, that's simply viewed as extra cost. And there was no incentive to actually investigate it kind of pre-COVID. And then COVID was disruptive, to where you weren't really looking at that so much. But in this current environment going forward, I see much more pressure on owners to figure out how to drive costs down. The example I gave before in the gas distribution space, 40% increase in spend, no increase in output. The owner looks at that and says, we've got to somehow drive down the spend and get the same output, or drive down the spend and get greater output, because we can't make the math work on these facilities. And so that's where I see this greater pressure going forward.
One last question is, what do you feel an organization like CURT could do, should do, to keep the fires burning in this space?
So Kurt already has a history of doing this type of thing.
That's right.
You remember back when Katrina occurred, and there was a group of people that were put together to try to facilitate how do we get materials and workforce to support the rebuilding after Katrina.
Yes.
I think a similar type of exercise could work, where there's a mechanism for Kurt to serve as kind of the coordinator, in some instances, gathering the cost and supporting the cost to investigate this. And then frankly, most of these tools are going to have to be piloted in some fashion. And so figuring out how to help organizations that are Kurt members to pilot these functions and then to report on the results in case studies will be critically important in my opinion.
Absolutely fascinating. Let's give it up for my friend Mark Bridgers.
Thank you.